The fluorescent lights of St. Mary's Hospital cast harsh shadows across my face as I cradled my 3-day-old daughter, Lily, against my chest. The soft beeping of monitors filled the maternity ward, a gentle reminder that we were safe, protected, surrounded by medical professionals who had sworn to do no harm. How naive I was to believe in such simple truths. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. She's beautiful. Emma, my mother-in-law Margaret cooed, leaning over the hospital bed with practiced grandmotherly enthusiasm. Those eyes are definitely Morrison family eyes. Just like David's when he was born. I managed a tired smile, adjusting Lily's tiny pink hat. After 36 hours of labor and an emergency C-section, exhaustion had settled into my bones like lead. But holding my daughter, feeling her tiny fingers curl around mine, made every moment of pain worthwhile. "Thank you for being here, Margaret," I murmured, though something in her tone made me uneasy. The way she said, Morrison family eyes, felt possessive, claiming, as if Lily belonged more to David's lineage than to both of us. David stood at the window, phone pressed to his ear, dealing with what he called urgent business matters that apparently couldn't wait even for his daughter's first days of life. His pharmaceutical company, Medicor Industries, had been consuming more and more of his attention lately, especially since the federal investigation into their clinical trial. Protocols had begun. "I should hold her," Margaret announced, not asked, already reaching for Lily. "You need rest, dear. New mothers shouldn't overexert themselves." Before I could protest, she had lifted Lily from my arms with the confidence of someone accustomed to getting her way. Margaret Morrison had been the hospital's head of pediatric nursing for over 20 years before retiring, and her authority in medical settings was absolute and unquestioned. "Actually, I'd like to keep her with me," I said softly, reaching out. "The nurses said skin-to-skin contact is important for bonding." Margaret's smile never wavered, but her grip on Lily tightened almost imperceptibly. "Oh, Emma, you've had such a difficult birth. The medications can make new mothers overwrought. Perhaps you should sleep while I watch over her." The dismissal in her voice triggered something deep in my chest, a protective instinct I'd never felt before. But before I could respond, David ended his call and turned toward us, his face grim. "The FDA is escalating their investigation," he said, running his hands through his hair. "They're questioning our trial data from the pediatric studies. This could destroy everything we've built." Margaret's expression shifted subtly, a flash of calculation crossing her features before settling back into grandmotherly concern. "How unfortunate. Just when we have a new addition to worry about." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, like this video, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. I watched this exchange with growing unease. In the 3 years I'd been married to David, I'd learned to read the undercurrents between him and his mother. They communicated in codes, in meaningful glances and carefully chosen words that excluded everyone else from their private understanding. "The baby needs her rest," Margaret said firmly, already walking toward the door with Lily. "I'll take her to the nursery. Hospital policy, you understand." "Wait," I called out, struggling to sit up despite the sharp pain from my incision. "I want her to stay here. Room in is standard now." Margaret paused, her back still turned. "Emma, dear, you're not thinking clearly. The medication, the trauma of birth, it's perfectly normal to feel confused. Trust me, I know what's best for babies." David barely looked up from his phone, where he was furiously typing messages. "Just let Mom handle it, Em. She knows hospitals better than anyone." That casual dismissal, that automatic deference to his mother's authority, should have been my first warning. But I was exhausted, in pain, and still riding the emotional roller coaster of new motherhood. So I watched helplessly as Margaret carried my daughter out of the room, Lily's tiny face disappearing around the corner. The door clicked shut with a finality that made my heart race. Hours passed in a haze of attempted sleep and growing anxiety. Every time I pressed the call button to ask about Lily, the nurses assured me she was doing beautifully in the nursery. But something felt wrong. The responses were too quick, too practiced, as if they'd been prepared in advance. When Margaret finally returned, she was alone. "Where's Lily?" I asked immediately, pushing myself upright despite the shooting pain. "Still in the nursery, dear. She needed some additional monitoring, nothing serious, just precautionary. Margaret's voice carried that same dismissive tone. But now I detected something else underneath: satisfaction. What kind of monitoring? No one told me, Emma, David interrupted, looking up from his laptop for the first time in hours. You need to stop questioning every medical decision. Mom has more experience with newborns than anyone. Just focus on recovering. The casual way he sided with his mother, the automatic assumption that I was being hysterical, sent a chill through me. But it was Margaret's expression that truly alarmed me, a subtle smugness, as if she knew something I didn't. I want to see my daughter, I said, my voice stronger now. Bring her back or I'm going to the nursery myself. The doctors don't think that's wise, Margaret replied smoothly. Your blood pressure has been elevated, and stress isn't good for healing. Perhaps in the morning. It is morning, I snapped, pointing to the window where dawn light was filtering through the blinds. I haven't seen Lily in 8 hours. That's not normal. David sighed heavily, the sound of a man dealing with an unreasonable woman. Fine. I'll go check on her. But you need to calm down, Emma. This paranoia isn't healthy. As he left the room, Margaret moved closer to my bed, her demeanor shifting subtly. The grandmotherly mask slipped just enough to reveal something harder underneath. You know, Emma, postpartum depression affects many new mothers. Especially those who had difficult births. The hormones, the stress, it can make you see problems where none exist. The word choice was deliberate, calculated. She was laying groundwork, establishing a narrative that would explain away any concerns I raised as symptoms of mental instability. I'm not depressed, I said carefully. I just want my baby. Of course you do. But wanting something and being capable of caring. For it are two different things. Margaret's voice carried the authority of her medical background, the subtle suggestion that she knew better than I did what was in Lily's best interest. 20 minutes later, David returned with a nurse I didn't recognize, not one of the women who had been caring for me since delivery. Mrs. Morrison, the nurse said, consulting her tablet with professional efficiency. I'm Nurse Patricia. I understand you're concerned about your daughter. Where is she? I asked directly. She's receiving excellent care in our specialized nursery. Dr. Williams wanted to monitor her breathing patterns as a precaution. What breathing patterns? She was fine when she was born. Her APGAR scores were perfect. Nurse Patricia exchanged a quick glance with Margaret, so fast I almost missed it. Sometimes issues don't present immediately. We're just being thorough. The explanation felt rehearsed, like a script they'd prepared. But I was outnumbered, in pain, and still weak from surgery. When I insisted on seeing Lily, they told me the specialized nursery had restricted access. When I asked to speak with Dr. Williams, they said he was in surgery. Every request was met with reasonable-sounding obstacles. By that afternoon, my anxiety had transformed into something sharper, suspicion. I waited until Margaret and David left for lunch, then carefully made my way to the nurse's station. My incision throbbed with every step, but determination overrode the pain. Excuse me, I said to the duty nurse, a young woman named Kelly whom I recognized from my first day. I need to know exactly where my daughter is and why I can't see her. Kelly's expression was sympathetic but guarded. Mrs. Morrison, I understand your concern, but, please, I interrupted. Just tell me where she is. Room number, which nursery, something concrete. Kelly hesitated, glancing around the station before leaning closer. There's been some confusion about your daughter's care plan. Dr. Williams wanted to discuss it with you personally. What kind of confusion? But Kelly was already pulling back, her professional mask sliding into place. I really can't say more. Hospital policy. As I made my way back to my room, moving slowly along the sterile corridors, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. Through an open doorway, I glimpsed Margaret talking quietly with a security guard near the elevator bank. Their conversation was too distant to hear, but their body language suggested an urgency that had nothing to do with grandmotherly concern. That night, alone in my room while David dealt with another urgent business call in the hallway, I made a decision that would change everything. I pressed the call button, and when the nurse arrived, I said the words that would eventually expose the truth. I want to file a formal complaint. I believe someone is preventing me from accessing my child. The nurse's reaction was immediate and telling. Her professional smile faltered, replaced by something that looked almost like fear. "Mrs. Morrison, I think you should discuss this with your husband first." "No," I said firmly. "I want to speak with hospital administration. Now." What I didn't know then was that my words were being recorded. Every conversation in the maternity ward was captured by the hospital's security system, part of a comprehensive monitoring program designed to protect newborns from abduction. Those recordings would later become the foundation of a case that would destroy lives and reveal truths that some people had killed to keep hidden, but that night, I only knew that my daughter was somewhere in this hospital, and someone was keeping her from me. The maternal instinct that had awakened the moment Lily was born was now a roaring fire in my chest, and I was done being dismissed as an overwrought new mother. Margaret returned an hour later, her expression unreadable as she settled into the visitor's chair. "I hear you've been making quite a fuss," she said, her voice carrying a warning. "The nurses are concerned about your state of mind." "My state of mind is fine. My concern is for my daughter, who I haven't seen in over 12 hours. Emma, dear," Margaret's voice took on that patronizing tone again, "sometimes the kindest thing we can do for a new mother is to take some of the burden off her shoulders. Especially when she's clearly struggling to cope." The word burden hung in the air between us like a thrown gauntlet. My daughter wasn't a burden, she was my heart walking around outside my body. But Margaret's phrasing revealed something crucial. She saw Lily as an obligation, not a joy. And obligations could be transferred. "What are you really saying, Margaret?" She smiled then, and for the first time, I saw the calculation behind it. "I'm saying that sometimes the people who love us most know what we need better than we do ourselves." The threat was clear, even wrapped in concerned family rhetoric. But what Margaret didn't know was that I had spent the last 3 years quietly documenting every slight, every manipulation, every attempt to control my marriage and my life. I had learned to be careful, to watch, to gather evidence before making accusations, and now, with my daughter's welfare at stake, all of that careful observation was about to pay off, because while Margaret thought she was orchestrating the perfect manipulation, she had no idea that the security cameras she'd helped design when the hospital was renovated 5 years ago were capturing every moment of her performance. Every lie, every threat, every manipulation was being preserved in digital format. The game was about to begin, but this time, I wasn't playing defense. As Margaret settled back in her chair with that satisfied smile, I closed my eyes and began to plan. She thought she held all the cards, but she was wrong about one crucial thing: that I wasn't just a new mother fighting for her child. I was a forensic accountant who had spent years following money trails and uncovering fraud. And something about David's panic over the FDA investigation, combined with Margaret's sudden interest in taking control of Lily, was triggering every professional instinct I'd honed over a decade of exposing corporate malfeasance. The pieces weren't fitting together yet, but they would, and when they did, Margaret Morrison was going to learn that sometimes the quietest person in the room is the one you should fear the most. The hospital administrator who arrived at my room the next morning was not what I expected. Dr. Sarah Chen was young, professional, and carried herself with the kind of quiet authority that suggested she didn't suffer fools gladly. More importantly, she brought a tablet and took notes, real notes, not the dismissive head nodding I'd grown accustomed to. "Mrs. Morrison, I understand you have concerns about your daughter's care," she began, settling into the chair Margaret had vacated moments before her arrival. "Can you walk me through exactly what's happened?" For the first time in 48 hours, someone was actually listening. I laid out the timeline methodically: Lily's removal to the nursery, the vague explanations, the restricted access, the increasing evasiveness of the staff. Dr. Chen's expression grew more serious with each detail. "Have you spoken with Dr. Williams directly?" she asked. "I've requested to speak with him multiple times. I'm told he's always in surgery or unavailable." Dr. Chen's fingers moved across her tablet. "According to our records, Dr. Williams has been on vacation in Barbados for the past week. He's not scheduled to return until Monday." The lie was so blatant, so easily disproven, that it took my breath away. Someone had been using his name to authorize medical decisions he couldn't possibly have made. "Who has been making decisions about my daughter's care?" I asked, my forensic training kicking in automatically. "That's what I intend to find out," Dr. Chen replied, and I heard steel in her voice. Mrs. Morrison, I need to ask you directly, do you have any reason to believe someone might be deliberately keeping you from your child? The question hung in the air like a loaded weapon. This was my moment, speak up or forever hold my peace. But before I could answer, David burst through the door, his face flushed with anger. Emma, what the hell do you think you're doing? He demanded, barely acknowledging Dr. Chen's presence. Mom told me you're making accusations against the hospital staff. This paranoid behavior has to stop. Dr. Chen stood slowly, her professional demeanor never wavering. Mr. Morrison, I'm Dr. Chen, hospital administration. We're simply investigating some discrepancies in your daughter's care documentation. Discrepancies? David's voice cracked slightly. What kind of discrepancies? The kind that require immediate clarification, Dr. Chen replied smoothly. I'll need to speak with you both separately, starting with Mrs. Morrison. Perhaps you could wait outside? David's jaw tightened, and I saw him fighting the urge to assert control over the situation. But Dr. Chen's authority was absolute here. And even he recognized it. Fine, he muttered. But Emma, you need to think about what you're doing. These accusations could have serious consequences. The threat was clear, but it only strengthened my resolve. After he left, Dr. Chen turned back to me with renewed focus. Mrs. Morrison, I need you to be completely honest with me. What do you think is really happening here? I took a deep breath, knowing that once I voiced my suspicions, there would be no going back. I think my mother-in-law is trying to gain custody of my daughter by making me appear mentally unstable. I think she's using her connections in this hospital to manipulate the situation, and I think my husband is either complicit or too distracted by his own problems to see what's happening. Dr. Chen nodded slowly. That's a serious allegation. Do you have any evidence to support it? Only patterns of behavior and the fact that every explanation I've been given has turned out to be false. I paused, then played my strongest card. But I'm a forensic accountant, Dr. Chen. I specialize in uncovering fraud and following paper trails. If you give me access to the documentation surrounding my daughter's care, I can probably tell you exactly what's been fabricated and what's real. Something shifted in Dr. Chen's expression, a recognition that she was dealing with someone who understood systems and evidence, not just an emotional new mother. I'm going to need to review our security footage, she said quietly. And I think you should know, your daughter is not currently in our specialized nursery. She's been moved to a private room in the pediatric wing, accessible only by keycard. The blood drained from my face. Moved? When? By whose authority? That's what I'm going to find out. But Mrs. Morrison, I need you to promise me something. Don't confront your husband or mother-in-law about this conversation. Let me investigate quietly first. After Dr. Chen left, I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, my mind racing through possibilities. Margaret's behavior, David's distraction with the FDA investigation, the mysterious move to a restricted wing, pieces of a puzzle that felt familiar from my professional work. This had all the hallmarks of a carefully orchestrated plan. My phone buzzed with a text from my sister Rachel, a defense attorney in Chicago. How's my new niece? Send photos. Instead of photos, I typed back, can you call me? Something's wrong. 20 minutes later, Rachel's voice filled my room through the speakerphone, sharp with concern after I'd outlined the situation. Emma, you need to document everything, times, names, exact conversations. And I'm driving down there tonight. You don't need to. Yes, I do. What you're describing sounds like custodial interference at minimum, possibly kidnapping. If Margaret is using her position to manipulate access to Lily, that's both criminal and actionable in family court. After hanging up, I began writing. Every conversation, every timestamp, every person who had denied me access to my daughter. The act of documentation felt familiar, comforting. It was what I did for a living, just with higher personal stakes. That afternoon, Margaret returned. With reinforcements, a woman introduced as Dr. Patricia Valdez, a psychiatrist specializing in postpartum disorders. Emma, dear, we're all concerned about you, Margaret began, her voice dripping with false sympathy. The staff has noticed some troubling behaviors, the accusations, the paranoia, the inability to trust medical professionals. Dr. Valdez has graciously agreed to evaluate your condition. Dr. Valdez was professionally polite but clearly operating from Margaret's script. Her questions were leading, designed to elicit responses that could be interpreted as signs of mental instability. Mrs. Morrison, I understand you've been making serious allegations about the hospital staff. Can you tell me what evidence you have for these claims? I've been denied access to my daughter for over 24 hours based on medical explanations that have proven false, I replied carefully. Dr. Williams, who allegedly ordered these restrictions, has been out of the country. Dr. Valdez made notes on her tablet. It's common for new mothers to feel anxious about their baby's care. Sometimes this anxiety can manifest as suspicion of medical authority. This isn't anxiety. This is a response to verifiable deception. Margaret leaned forward in her chair. Emma, honey, you need to listen to Dr. Valdez. She's here to help you understand what you're experiencing. I looked. Between them, two women using their professional credentials to gaslight me into accepting a narrative of my own instability. But I had learned something important from my years investigating fraud. When people are lying to you systematically, they always make mistakes. You just had to be patient enough to catch them. Dr. Valdez, I said calmly, what specific medical concerns require my daughter to be housed in a keycard restricted room in the pediatric wing? The question hit like a precision strike. Dr. Valdez blinked, clearly unprepared. She hadn't been briefed on that detail. I'm sorry, what? She stammered. Margaret's face flushed slightly. Emma, you're confused. Lily is in the regular nursery. No, she's not. Hospital administration confirmed she's been moved to a restricted area. So either you don't know where my daughter actually is, or you've been lying to me about her location. The silence that followed was deafening. Dr. Valdez looked to Margaret for clarification, clearly realizing she'd walked into something more complex than a simple postpartum evaluation. I think, Dr. Valdez said carefully, I need to speak with the medical team before continuing this assessment. After they left, I felt a grim satisfaction. I'd forced them to show their hand, exposed the inconsistencies in their story. But I also knew I'd escalated the situation. Whatever they were planning, they'd have to move faster now. That evening, David returned with news that made everything click into place. The FDA has expanded their investigation, he said, pacing at the foot of my bed. They're looking into our entire pediatric trial program. If they find evidence of data manipulation, the company is finished. We could be looking at criminal charges. What kind of criminal charges? I asked, though I was already connecting the dots. Fraud, endangering children, falsifying medical records, the works. Mom thinks we should prepare for the worst-case scenario. And there it was. Margaret wasn't just trying to gain custody of Lily out of grandmother's love or concern for my mental health. She was positioning herself to protect a grandchild from parents who might soon be under federal investigation, but something about David's demeanor suggested he didn't fully understand what Margaret was orchestrating. His focus was entirely on the business crisis, leaving him blind to the personal disaster unfolding around him. David, I said carefully, where exactly is Lily right now? He looked up from his phone, surprised by the question. In the nursery. Where she's been. Why? When did you last actually see her? The question made him pause, his brow furrowing as he tried to remember. Yesterday morning, I think? Mom's been handling the baby stuff while I deal with this FDA nightmare. So you haven't seen our daughter in over 36 hours, and that doesn't concern you? Emma, she's fine. Mom's taking care of everything. But even as he said it, uncertainty crept into his voice. That night, after David left for another crisis meeting, I made my decision. Rachel would arrive in the morning, but I couldn't wait any longer. I needed to see Lily myself, even if it meant confronting whatever security measures had been put in place. I waited until the night shift settled into their routines, then carefully made my way out of bed. My incision protested every movement, but determination overrode the pain. I'd studied the hospital layout during my stay, noting the locations of security cameras and staff stations. The pediatric wing was 3 floors up, accessible by elevator or stairwell. I chose the stairs, moving slowly and stopping frequently to rest. Each step brought me closer to answers I wasn't sure I was ready to face. The pediatric floor was dimmer than the maternity ward, with longer stretches between nursing stations. I found the restricted area Dr. Chen had mentioned, a corridor blocked by keycard access, with 2 private rooms beyond. Through the window of the first room, I saw her. Lily was sleeping peacefully in a standard hospital crib, monitors tracking her vital signs. She looked perfect, healthy, exactly as she had when Margaret first took her from my arms. But she was also completely isolated, cut off from the normal flow of hospital life. As I pressed my face to the glass, trying to drink in the sight of my daughter, I heard footsteps approaching. I turned to find Margaret standing behind me, her expression unreadable in the dim hallway lighting. "You shouldn't be here, Emma," she said quietly. "You're not well enough to be walking around." "Why is my daughter in a restricted room?" Margaret moved closer, and I saw something in her eyes I'd never noticed before, a cold calculation that had nothing to do with grandmother's love. "Because sometimes," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "the people we love most need protection from situations they don't fully understand." It wasn't an answer, but it was a confession. Margaret knew exactly what she was doing, and she believed she was justified in doing it. What she didn't know was that her confession had just been recorded by the security camera mounted in the corner above us. The same system she'd helped design was now capturing her in her own trap. Rachel arrived at dawn like a force of nature, striding into my hospital room with the focused intensity of a prosecutor preparing for trial. My sister had always been the fighter between us, the one who turned protective instincts into professional weapons. "Show me everything," she said without preamble, pulling out a legal pad and digital recorder. "Timeline, names, documentation. And I want to review every piece of paperwork they've made you sign since you got here." As I walked her through the events of the past 3 days, Rachel's expression grew progressively darker. She made notes in her precise lawyer's handwriting, occasionally asking for clarification or requesting exact quotes. "The psychiatric evaluation they tried to conduct yesterday, did you sign anything giving consent?" she asked. "No. Dr. Valdez said it was just an informal assessment." There's no such thing as an informal psychiatric assessment in a hospital setting. Any evaluation that could be used in legal proceedings requires written consent. Rachel's pen scratched across the paper. "They're building a paper trail to support claims of mental instability, but they're cutting legal corners to do it." She was interrupted by a soft knock at the door. Dr. Chen entered, her expression grave. "Mrs. Morrison, I've completed my preliminary investigation, and I think you need to see what I've found." She nodded politely to Rachel. "I assume this is the family member you mentioned?" "My sister Rachel, she's an attorney." Dr. Chen's relief was visible. "Good. You're going to need legal representation." She opened her tablet, displaying what looked like a medical chart. "This is the official documentation for your daughter's care since birth. According to these records, Lily has been treated for respiratory distress, feeding difficulties, and signs of withdrawal syndrome." My heart stopped. "Withdrawal syndrome? From what?" "According to the chart, you tested positive for opioids during delivery." The accusation hit like a physical blow. "That's impossible. I haven't taken anything stronger than prenatal vitamins. I don't even drink alcohol." Rachel leaned forward, her lawyer instinct sharpening. "Dr. Chen, I assume you've verified these test results?" "That's where things get interesting. The lab results referenced in the chart don't exist in our system. The test orders were allegedly placed by Dr. Williams, who, as we established, has been out of the country. And the medical decisions based on these fictitious results were authorized by your mother-in-law." "Margaret authorized medical decisions?" "She's retired," I protested. "Retired, but still holding a valid nursing license and temporary privileges. In our pediatric unit. She requested those privileges 3 weeks ago, citing her expertise in newborn care and her family relationship to the patient." 3 weeks ago. Before Lily was even born. Rachel's pen moved rapidly across her legal pad. "Dr. Chen, this sounds like premeditated medical fraud. What authority does the hospital have to investigate and rectify this situation?" "Full authority. And Mrs. Morrison, I need to ask you directly, would you consent to a legitimate drug screening right now, administered by our independent lab?" "Absolutely." Within an hour, blood and urine samples had been drawn and rushed to the lab with priority processing. Dr. Chen had also begun pulling security footage from the past 3 days, promising to have a comprehensive review completed by afternoon, but Margaret wasn't waiting for official investigations to conclude. She arrived just as the lab technician was leaving, her face a mask of concerned authority. "Emma, what's all this commotion? The staff is saying you're having more tests done." Her eyes flicked to Rachel with poorly concealed annoyance. "And who might this be?" "I'm Rachel Martinez, Emma's sister and legal counsel," Rachel replied with professional coolness. "I understand there have been some irregularities in my niece's medical care." Margaret's composure slipped for just a moment, a flash of calculation, before the grandmother mask reasserted itself. "Legal counsel? Emma, honey, why would you need a lawyer? We're all family here." "Family doesn't fabricate medical records," I said quietly. The silence that followed was electric. Margaret's eyes darted between Rachel and me, assessing this new dynamic. She was used to controlling situations through medical authority and family hierarchy, but a defense attorney changed the game entirely. "I don't know what you think you've discovered," Margaret said finally, "but I hope you'll consider the consequences of making reckless accusations, especially given your current state of mind." Rachel stood slowly, and I recognized the predatory stillness that meant she'd identified her target. "Mrs. Morrison, are you threatening my client?" "Of course not. I'm simply concerned about a new mother who appears to be spiraling into paranoid delusions. It's more common than people think, especially after traumatic births. Traumatic births that somehow require fabricated drug tests and unauthorized medical decisions." Margaret's face hardened. "I don't know what you think you've proven, but I've been protecting babies for 20 years. Sometimes that means protecting them from parents who aren't capable of providing appropriate care." There it was, the admission Rachel had been fishing for. Margaret believed she was protecting Lily from me, and she was willing to commit fraud to do it. "Dr. Chen," Rachel called out, knowing she was monitoring the conversation from the hallway. "I think you should hear this." Dr. Chen entered with a security guard and what looked like hospital legal counsel. The room suddenly felt very crowded and very official. "Mrs. Morrison," Dr. Chen addressed Margaret, "I need you to explain your authorization of medical decisions for a patient outside your area of practice and your creation of medical records not supported by actual test results." Margaret straightened, drawing on decades of medical authority. "I acted in the best interests of a newborn whose mother was clearly impaired. Any nurse with pediatric experience would have made the same decisions. Based on test results that don't exist. Based on behavioral observations and clinical judgment." Dr. Chen consulted her tablet. "Clinical judgment that led you to isolate a healthy newborn from her mother and authorize treatment for conditions she doesn't have?" The legal counsel stepped forward. "Mrs. Morrison, I'm going to have to ask you to surrender your temporary privileges immediately. You're also required to attend a formal review hearing tomorrow morning." Margaret's mask finally slipped completely, revealing the steel underneath. "You're making a serious mistake. When David's company collapses under federal investigation, when he's facing criminal charges for endangering children through fraudulent drug trials, you'll understand why I had to act." The room went dead silent. Margaret had just revealed the real motive behind her actions, not grandmother's love, but damage control for a family facing federal prosecution. "Mrs. Morrison," Rachel said quietly, "you've just confessed to conspiracy and medical fraud in front of witnesses." Margaret's face went pale as she realized what she'd done. But instead of backing down, she doubled down with the desperation of someone who believed her actions were justified. "That baby deserves a stable home with people who can provide for her properly. Not parents who might be in federal prison by Christmas." "That's not your decision to make," Dr. Chen said firmly. "Security will escort you from the premises. You're banned from this hospital pending investigation." As Margaret was led away, her parting words chilled me to the bone. "This isn't over, Emma. I won't let you destroy that child's future." After the room cleared, Rachel turned to me with grim satisfaction. "We've got her on conspiracy, fraud, custodial interference, and possibly kidnapping. But Emma, we need to talk about what she said about David's company." I nodded, my mind already working through the implications. If Medicorp is facing criminal charges for endangering children, and Margaret knew about it 3 weeks ago, she's been planning this since before Lily was born. The question is, what else has she done to build her case for custody? That afternoon brought answers I wasn't prepared for. Dr. Chen returned with security footage that painted a picture of elaborate deception spanning the entire time I'd been in the hospital. This is from yesterday morning, she said, showing tablet footage of Margaret entering a computer terminal at the nurse's station. She's accessing patient records and entering false information. The video showed Margaret working quickly and efficiently, her fingers flying over the keyboard with the confidence of someone who knew exactly what she was doing. Here she is moving Lily to the restricted room, Dr. Chen continued, advancing the footage. And here's where it gets interesting. The next video showed Margaret meeting with a man in an expensive suit in the hospital cafeteria. Their conversation was too distant to hear, but their body language suggested serious discussion of sensitive matters. Do you recognize him? Dr. Chen asked. I stared at the screen, then felt my blood turn to ice. That's Marcus Webb. He's David's business partner and the chief financial officer of Medicore. Rachel leaned forward. What would David's CFO be doing? Meeting secretly with Margaret in a hospital cafeteria? The answer came with the next piece of footage, Marcus Webb handing Margaret a thick envelope that she quickly tucked into her purse. Dr. Chen, Rachel said slowly, I think we're looking at more than medical fraud. This looks like a coordinated effort involving multiple conspirators. My phone buzzed with a text from David, crisis meeting tonight. FDA expanding investigation again. Might need to prepare for worst case scenario. I showed the message to Rachel, whose expression grew even more serious. Emma, I think Margaret and David's business partner have been planning to gain custody of Lily as insurance against whatever's coming with the federal investigation. A baby in Margaret's custody would be protected from asset seizure and couldn't be used as leverage against David in plea negotiations. The scope of the conspiracy was staggering. My daughter wasn't just being used as a pawn in family manipulation, she was a strategic asset in what looked like a complex federal case. What do we do now? I asked. Rachel gathered her papers with the methodical efficiency of a prosecutor building a case. Now we contact the FBI. Because if Medicore is under federal investigation for endangering children, and Margaret is conspiring to hide assets related to that investigation, we're looking at federal crimes. She paused at the door. And Emma? Get some rest. Tomorrow we're going to war. That night, alone in my hospital room with the weight of everything I'd learned, I finally understood the true scope of what I was fighting. This wasn't just about a grandmother overstepping boundaries or a husband too distracted to notice his wife's concerns. This was about powerful people using an innocent baby as a shield against federal prosecution. Margaret hadn't been protecting Lily from me, she'd been protecting the Morrison family assets from the government, but she'd made one crucial mistake. She'd underestimated a mother's determination to protect her child, and now, with security footage documenting her crimes and federal investigators already circling David's company, Margaret Morrison was about to learn that sometimes the quiet person you dismiss as powerless is actually the one who destroys your carefully laid plans. The war Rachel had promised was about to begin. But unlike Margaret, I wasn't fighting to protect assets or maintain power. I was fighting to bring my daughter home. The FBI agents arrived at 7 a.m. sharp, their credentials gleaming under the harsh hospital lighting. Special Agent Maria Santos was a woman in her 40s with the kind of quiet intensity that suggested she'd seen everything and forgotten nothing. Her partner, Agent James Rodriguez, carried himself with military precision and took notes in a compact handwriting that spoke of years documenting federal crimes. Mrs. Morrison, Agent Santos began, settling into the visitor's chair with practiced ease, your sister contacted our white-collar crime division yesterday evening. She indicated you might have information relevant to an ongoing federal investigation. I glanced at Rachel, who nodded encouragingly. I believe my mother-in-law has been conspiring to gain custody of my newborn daughter to protect family assets from your investigation into Medicore Industries. Agent Rodriguez looked up from his notepad. What makes you think we're investigating Medicore? My husband told me. He's been panicking about FDA scrutiny of their pediatric drug trials. And yesterday, security footage showed Margaret meeting secretly with Marcus Webb, David's business partner, who gave her what looked like payment. The agents exchanged a glance that told me everything I needed to know. They were indeed investigating Medicore, and the name Marcus Webb meant something significant to them. Mrs. Morrison, Agent Santos leaned forward. I need to be very clear about something. We cannot discuss the details of any ongoing investigation. However, if you're alleging that individuals connected to Medicorp have committed federal crimes in attempting to gain custody of your child, that falls under our jurisdiction. Agent Rodriguez consulted his notes. The hospital administrator provided us with security footage and documentation. The fabricated medical records alone constitute federal fraud when used to justify custody decisions. But the conspiracy aspect makes this much more serious. Rachel had been listening intently, her legal mind processing the implications. Agents, if Margaret Morrison was being paid to orchestrate this custody grab, and if it's connected to protecting assets from federal prosecution, we're looking at obstruction of justice charges as well. That's correct, Agent Santos confirmed. Mrs. Morrison, we're going to need your full cooperation. This investigation may require you to wear recording devices and potentially testify before a federal grand jury. The weight of their words settled over me like a heavy blanket. I had wanted to protect my daughter and expose Margaret's manipulation. I hadn't expected to become a federal witness in a case that could destroy lives and careers. What about Lily? I asked. When can I have my daughter back? That's being expedited, Agent Rodriguez assured me. Child Protective Services is already involved, and with the evidence of fabricated medical records, they're prepared to immediately restore your custody. In fact, your daughter is being moved back to your room as we speak. As if summoned by his words, Dr. Chen appeared in the doorway wielding a hospital bassinet. Inside was Lily, sleeping peacefully, looking exactly as perfect as when I'd first held her 4 days ago. The medical evaluation is complete, Dr. Chen announced. Lily is perfectly healthy. No respiratory issues, no feeding problems, and definitely no signs of drug withdrawal. She's ready to go home with her mother. I lifted my daughter from the bassinet, feeling her warm weight against my chest like a missing piece of my soul clicking back into place. Lily stirred slightly, opening those dark Morrison eyes that Margaret had claimed so possessively, and I felt the fierce protective rage that had been building for days transform into something sharper. Determination. Agent Santos watched the reunion with professional detachment before continuing. Mrs. Morrison, we're going to need to move quickly. Our investigation into Medicorp has reached a critical phase, and if your mother-in-law is attempting to hide assets, she may escalate her efforts when she realizes her custody plan has failed. What kind of escalation? Rachel asked, her attorney instincts picking up on the subtle warning. Flight risk, Agent Rodriguez said bluntly. If Margaret Morrison believes she's facing federal charges, she may attempt to leave the country with your daughter. The thought sent ice through my veins. She can't do that. She doesn't have any legal rights to Lily. Legal rights haven't stopped her so far, Agent Santos pointed out. Mrs. Morrison, we'd like to place protective surveillance on you and your daughter, and we need you to be very careful about any contact with Margaret or her associates. As if hearing her name had summoned her, my phone buzzed with a text from Margaret. We need to talk. Meet me in the hospital chapel in 1 hour. Come alone, and bring Lily. This is bigger than you understand. I showed the message to the agents, whose expressions sharpened immediately. That's our opening, Agent Santos said, pulling out her own phone. Mrs. Morrison, would you be willing to wear a wire to this meeting? The next hour unfolded with the precision of a federal operation. A tiny recording device was attached to my clothing, backup agents were positioned throughout the hospital, and Dr. Chen had arranged for hospital security to discreetly monitor the chapel area. Rachel had wanted to object to putting me in potential danger, but I overruled her. Margaret had manipulated me for the last time. If she wanted a meeting, she would get one, just not the kind she was expecting. I arrived at the chapel exactly on time, Lily sleeping peacefully in my arms. The non-denominational space was designed for contemplation and comfort, with soft lighting and simple wooden pews. Margaret was already there, seated in the front row, her back straight with the rigid posture of someone preparing for battle. Thank you for coming, she said without turning around. I wasn't sure you would. You asked to see your granddaughter. I replied, keeping my voice neutral. Here she is. Margaret finally turned, and I was shocked by her appearance. The woman who had always presented herself as perfectly composed looked haggard, her makeup unable to completely hide the stress lines around her eyes. Emma, I need you to understand something. What I did wasn't about taking Lily away from you. It was about protecting her from what's coming. What's coming, Margaret? She stood slowly, moving closer but not quite within arm's reach. David's company is going to be destroyed. The FDA investigation is just the beginning. When the criminal charges come down, when the civil lawsuits start, when the media gets hold of what Medicore has been doing to children in their drug trials, she paused, and I heard genuine anguish in her voice. That little girl deserves better than growing up as the daughter of parents who might spend the next decade in federal prison. So you decided to steal her? I decided to save her, Margaret corrected sharply. Do you know what Medicore has been doing, Emma? Do you know what your husband has been covering up? I held Lily closer, feeling the recording device against my ribs. Tell me. Margaret looked around the chapel, as if seeking divine guidance for what she was about to reveal. They've been falsifying safety data in pediatric drug trials. Children have been seriously harmed, some permanently, because David and Marcus have been manipulating test results to get FDA approval for drugs that should never have reached the market. The revelation hit like a physical blow. My husband, the man I'd married and trusted, had been endangering children for profit. How long have you known? I asked. 6 months. Marcus came to me when the internal investigation started. They needed someone with medical credentials to help them manage the narrative. Someone who could vouch for the integrity of their pediatric protocols. And you agreed? Margaret's face crumpled slightly. I thought I could help them find a way to make it right. But when I saw the real data, when I understood how many children had been hurt, she stopped, composing herself with visible effort. That's when I realized Lily needed protection. Not just from the legal consequences, but from parents who were capable of hurting children for money. The recording device felt heavy against my chest as I processed this information. Margaret's actions, while illegal and inexcusable, suddenly made a twisted kind of sense. She genuinely believed she was protecting Lily from morally compromised parents. Margaret, what did Marcus Webb pay you to do? Her eyes sharpened, and I saw her recognize that I knew about their meeting. He paid me to create a medical justification for emergency custody. To document your unfitness as a mother and establish myself as Lily's primary caregiver until the federal investigation concluded. By fabricating drug test results. By any means necessary, she said without remorse. Emma, you don't understand the scope of what's coming. When this investigation goes public, the Morrison name will be synonymous with child endangerment. Lily will carry that burden her entire life unless someone protects her from it. I stood slowly, Lily still sleeping peacefully in my arms. You're right about one thing, Margaret. Children do need protection from people who hurt them for personal gain. Her expression grew wary. What do you mean? I mean that fabricating medical records to steal a baby is also child endangerment. Conspiring to commit federal crimes is also morally compromised. You became the very thing you were trying to protect Lily from. Margaret's face hardened. I did what was necessary. No, you did what was profitable. Marcus Webb paid you to solve a problem for Medicore, and you were willing to destroy your own family to collect that payment. The chapel door opened behind me, and Agent Santos stepped inside with 2 other agents. Margaret's face went white as she realized she'd been recorded. Margaret Morrison, Agent Santos announced, you're under arrest for conspiracy to commit fraud, obstruction of justice, and custodial interference in connection with a federal investigation. As the agents moved to handcuff her, Margaret looked at me with something that might have been respect mixed with fury. You think you've won, Emma, but this is just the beginning. When David's world collapses, when the media circus starts, when Lily grows up knowing her father destroyed children's lives for profit, remember that I tried to spare her from that knowledge. I'll remember that you tried to steal my daughter, I replied. And I'll make sure Lily knows the difference between protecting children and using them. As Margaret was led away, Agent Rodriguez approached me with professional sympathy. Mrs. Morrison, we'll need a full deposition about everything she told you regarding Medicore's activities. Her confession about the falsified drug trial data is crucial evidence in our investigation. I looked down at Lily, still sleeping peacefully despite the chaos surrounding her. My daughter would indeed grow up knowing difficult truths about her father's company and her grandmother's choices. But she would also grow up knowing that her mother had fought for justice, not just personal vindication. The federal investigation Margaret had tried to hide from was about to become very public indeed. And thanks to her own confessions, the government now had everything they needed to dismantle the conspiracy that had put countless children at risk. Margaret had been right about one thing: this was just the beginning. But she'd been wrong about who would control how it ended. The news of Margaret's arrest reached David before I could tell him myself. He burst into my hospital room that evening, his face a mask of confusion and fury, his expensive suit wrinkled from what looked like hours of crisis meetings. "What the hell did you do, Emma?" he demanded, barely glancing at Lily sleeping peacefully in my arms. "The FBI just arrested my mother. They're saying she's part of some conspiracy. This is insane." I looked at my husband, really looked at him, and saw a stranger. The man I'd married had been charming, ambitious, driven by what I'd thought was legitimate business success. Now I saw the desperation in his eyes, the telltale signs of someone whose carefully constructed world was collapsing. "David, sit down. We need to talk." "Talk? Emma, my mother is in federal custody. The company's stock has crashed 20% in the last hour. Our lawyers are going insane trying to figure out what charges she's facing." He paced frantically at the foot of my bed. "And somehow this all started with you making crazy accusations about baby care?" Agent Santos had warned me this moment would come, when David realized that his wife had become the catalyst for his mother's arrest and, by extension, the federal investigation that would destroy his company. She'd given me specific instructions about how to handle it. "David, how long have you known about the falsified pediatric trial data?" The question hit him like a physical blow. He stopped pacing, his face going pale. "What are you talking about?" "Your mother confessed everything this afternoon. The fake safety data, the children who were harmed, Marcus Webb's payments to create a custody case that would protect family assets." I kept my voice steady, clinical. "She told me you and Marcus have been manipulating drug trial results for months." David's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. She told you what?" "She thought she was protecting Lily from parents who were facing federal prison time for child endangerment. She was wrong about the method, but she wasn't wrong about the charges coming your way." The silence that followed was deafening. David sank into the visitor's chair, his head in his hands. When he finally looked up, I saw something I'd never seen before in his eyes: genuine fear. "Emma, you don't understand the pressure we've been under. The FDA approval process takes years, costs millions. Our investors were threatening to pull funding. We just adjusted some of the data to speed things along." Adjusted data that was supposed to protect children's safety. "The drugs work. They help kids with serious conditions. We just smoothed out some of the statistical noise that was making the FDA nervous." I felt sick listening to him rationalize endangering children as smoothing statistical noise. This wasn't the man I'd fallen in love with, or maybe it was, and I'd just been too naive to see it. "David, children were permanently harmed. Your mother said some of them. My mother doesn't know what she's talking about," he exploded, then caught himself, glancing nervously at the door. "She's a retired nurse, not a pharmaceutical researcher. She doesn't understand the complexities of drug development." But his defensive anger couldn't hide the truth in his eyes. He knew exactly what had been done and what the consequences were. My phone buzzed with a text from Rachel: "Federal grand jury convened. Multiple indictments expected within 48 hours. David's name is on the list." I showed him the message. The color drained completely from his face. "Emma, you have to help me. Whatever my mother told you, whatever she confessed to, you can't let them use it. Spousal privilege, attorney-client confidentiality, something. Spousal privilege doesn't apply when you're committing crimes against children, David. And I'm not your attorney, I'm your wife. Or I was." The past tense hung in the air between us like a death sentence. David's expression shifted through several emotions: disbelief, anger, desperation, before settling on something that looked almost like relief. "You're leaving me. I'm protecting our daughter from people who hurt children for profit. That includes you." He stood abruptly, pulling out his phone. "I need to call Marcus. We need to coordinate our legal strategy. Marcus Webb is also being arrested, David. Probably right now." As if summoned by my words, Agent Rodriguez appeared in the doorway. "David Morrison, you're under arrest for conspiracy to commit fraud, endangering the welfare of children, and obstruction of justice in Connection with falsified drug trial data. David's phone clattered to the floor as the handcuffs clicked around his wrists. He looked at me with something that might have been betrayal or might have been understanding. "Take care of Lily," he said quietly as Agent Rodriguez led him away. "Whatever happens, she's innocent in all of this." After they left, I sat in the sudden silence, holding my daughter and trying to process the fact that my husband, the father of my child, was now in federal custody for crimes that had harmed other people's children. Rachel arrived 20 minutes later with a stack of legal documents and a grim expression. "The indictments are extensive," she said without preamble. "David, Marcus Webb, 2 other Medicorps executives, and Margaret are all facing federal charges. The evidence from Margaret's confession and the company's internal documents is overwhelming." She pulled out a folder marked "Confidential" and opened it carefully. "Emma, I need to prepare you for what's coming. The media is already picking up the story. By tomorrow morning, this is going to be national news." I looked down at Lily, sleeping peacefully in her hospital blanket, blissfully unaware that she'd just become the center of a federal scandal. What about Lily's future? College funds, trust accounts. If David goes to prison, that's actually why I'm here. Rachel pulled out another set of documents. The federal asset seizure laws are complex, but there are protections for innocent family members. We need to establish that you had no knowledge of or participation in the criminal activities. Over the next hour, Rachel walked me through the legal labyrinth I was about to enter. Testimony before federal grand juries, potential media attention. The challenge of raising a child while her father served a federal sentence. It was overwhelming. "There's something else," Rachel said as we finished the initial paperwork. "Agent Santos wants to offer you a deal. Full immunity and victim status in exchange for your complete cooperation with the investigation." Victim status? Margaret's conspiracy to gain custody of Lily was part of the larger criminal enterprise. "You and Lily were victimized by their attempts to hide assets and obstruct justice. It's a designation that comes with legal protections and financial restitution." The irony wasn't lost on me. Margaret's attempts to protect Lily from the consequences of her parents' actions had actually made us both victims of federal crimes. My phone rang, an unknown number. Rachel nodded for me to answer. "Mrs. Morrison? This is Janet Chen from Channel 7 News. We understand you're at the center of a major federal investigation involving pharmaceutical fraud and child endangerment. Would you be willing to comment on your husband's arrest?" I hung up without responding, but the call was a preview of what was coming. By morning, reporters would be camped outside the hospital, trying to get photos of the wife and baby at the center of a federal scandal. "We need to get you out of here," Rachel said, already pulling out her phone. "I'm arranging a safe house through the Federal Witness Protection Program. Temporary, just until the media attention dies down." As if to emphasize her point, my phone rang again. Then again. The story was breaking, and I was about to become public property. That night, as I prepared to leave the hospital where this entire nightmare had begun, Dr. Chen stopped by one last time. "Mrs. Morrison, I want you to know that your courage in speaking up has probably saved countless children from being harmed by Medicorps drugs. The FDA is pulling their products from the market pending complete safety reviews." I thought about those children, kids who would never know that a new mother's fight to protect her own baby had indirectly protected them too. There was some comfort in that knowledge, even amid the chaos of my personal life falling apart. The safe house was a modest apartment in a suburb 40 minutes from the hospital. Federal marshals had swept it for security, and Agent Santos assured me it was completely off the grid. For the first time in a week, Lily and I were truly alone together. As I fed her that first night in our temporary sanctuary, I realized that everything I'd thought I knew about my life had been an illusion. My successful husband was a criminal. My concerned mother-in-law was a conspirator. My perfect suburban existence had been built on the suffering of innocent children, but I also realized something else. I was stronger than I'd ever imagined. I'd taken on a powerful family, exposed federal crimes, and protected my daughter from people who would have used her as a shield for their criminal activities. My phone buzzed with a message from Agent Santos. "Grand jury returns indictments tomorrow. Press conference at 2 p.m. Your testimony was crucial to the case. Thank you for having the courage to speak up." I looked down at Lily, her tiny fingers wrapped around mine as she slept. Tomorrow, the world would learn about Medicore's crimes and the conspiracy to cover them up. There would be trials, media attention, and probably years of legal proceedings. But tonight, for the first time since she was born, my daughter was safe, free from the manipulation and fraud that had surrounded her first days of life. Margaret had been right about one thing: Lily did deserve protection from people who hurt children for personal gain. She just hadn't realized that included her grandmother, her father, and everyone else who had prioritized money and power over the welfare of innocent kids. The reckoning was just beginning, but I was ready for it. Because sometimes the most important fight isn't the one you choose, it's the one that chooses you. The press conference was a carefully orchestrated performance that I watched from my safe house, Lily sleeping peacefully in my arms while my life was dissected on national television. U.S. Attorney General Patricia Holbrook stood behind a podium flanked by FBI and FDA officials, her voice steady and authoritative as she announced the indictments that would destroy everything David had built. Today, we announced charges against 5 individuals connected to Medicore Industries for their roles in a conspiracy to defraud the FDA and endanger the welfare of children participating in pharmaceutical trials, she began, reading from prepared remarks that I knew were built on my testimony and Margaret's recorded confession. The camera panned across photographs of the defendants: David, looking corporate and confident in what was probably his company headshot; Marcus Webb, stern and calculating; Margaret, wearing her hospital ID badge and a photo that must have been from her nursing days; and 2 other Medicore executives I'd never met but whose crimes were now forever linked to my family's destruction. The defendants allegedly falsified safety data for pediatric medications, putting vulnerable children at risk to expedite FDA approval and maximize profits, Attorney General Holbrook continued. When federal investigators began examining these activities, several defendants conspired to obstruct justice by attempting to gain improper custody of a family member's infant child to use as leverage in plea negotiations. They didn't mention my name, but anyone who knew the Morrison family would immediately understand that the family member's infant child was Lily. My daughter had become a footnote in a federal conspiracy case, her first week of life forever entangled with her father's crimes. My phone had been buzzing constantly since the press conference began. Reporters who had somehow obtained my number despite federal protection, old college friends who'd seen the news, distant relatives suddenly concerned about my well-being. I'd turned it to silent after the 15th call, but the screen continued lighting up with ignored notifications. Rachel arrived an hour after the press conference ended, carrying newspapers and a tablet loaded with news coverage. "It's everywhere," she said without preamble, spreading the papers across the safe house coffee table. Wall Street Journal, New York Times, Washington Post. CNN has been running the story every hour on the hour. The headlines were brutal: Pharma exec arrested in child endangerment scheme. Baby used as shield in federal fraud case. Grandmother's custody plot exposes drug trial conspiracy. I picked up the Washington Post, which had somehow obtained a photo of David in handcuffs being led from the hospital. The caption read, "David Morrison, VP of Medicore Industries, arrested on federal charges related to falsified pediatric drug trials and conspiracy to obstruct justice." "They're calling it one of the largest pharmaceutical fraud cases in decades," Rachel continued, scrolling through her tablet. "Stock prices for similar companies are tanking. Congress is already talking about hearings on FDA oversight." The scope of the fallout was staggering. What had started as my fight to protect Lily from Margaret's manipulation had exposed corruption that was reshaping an entire industry. "Emma," Rachel said carefully, "there's something else. Several news organizations have identified you by name. Your photo is circulating on social media." She showed me her tablet screen, where a picture from my wedding to David had been posted with the caption, "Emma Morrison, wife of arrested Medicore executive, reportedly exposed the conspiracy while fighting for custody of her newborn daughter." The wedding photo looked like it had been taken in another lifetime. The woman in the white dress, smiling adoringly at David, had no idea she was marrying someone capable of endangering children for profit. That Emma had trusted completely, questioned nothing, and believed in the fairy tale of her perfect suburban life. "The narrative is actually quite favorable to you," Rachel noted. "You're being portrayed as a heroic mother who uncovered federal crimes while protecting her baby. But Emma, the media attention is going to be intense. We need to prepare for interview requests, documentary producers, book publishers. I don't want any of that, I interrupted. I just want to raise my daughter in peace. I understand, but this story has captured public imagination. The idea of a new mother taking down a pharmaceutical conspiracy by fighting for her baby, it's compelling. And frankly, controlling the narrative might be important for Lily's future. I looked down at my daughter, who had slept through the entire press conference that announced her father's federal charges. She was too young to understand that her life had just become public property, that strangers across the country were discussing her family's destruction over their morning coffee. What kind of interview requests? I asked reluctantly. Rachel pulled out a folder thick with messages. 60 Minutes, Dateline, Good Morning America. CNN wants an exclusive. And Emma, there are already 3 book agents who want to represent you. The preliminary offers are substantial. The idea of profiting from this nightmare felt wrong, but I had to think practically. David's assets would be frozen during the trial, and conviction would mean years of legal fees and potentially no financial support. Lily's future might depend on whatever income one could generate from telling our story. There's more, Rachel continued. The families of children harmed by Medicorp's drugs are organizing. They want to meet with you, to thank you for exposing what happened to their kids. That hit differently than the media attention. These were real families whose children had suffered because of David's choices, and my actions had given them justice they might never have received otherwise. How many children? I asked quietly. Rachel consulted her notes. The FDA's preliminary investigation has identified 47 children who experienced serious adverse effects that should have prevented drug approval. 12 required hospitalization. 3 have permanent developmental delays. The numbers felt like physical blows. 47 children. My husband's company had harmed 47 children to increase their profits, and then Margaret had tried to steal my baby to hide evidence of those crimes. I want to meet with their families, I said firmly. Not for media purposes. Just to apologize. To let them know that not everyone in the Morrison family knew what was happening. My phone buzzed with a call from an unknown number. I'd been ignoring them all day, but something made me answer this one. Mrs. Morrison? This is Linda Carver. My 8-year-old son Jeremy was in one of your husband's drug trials. I just wanted to say thank you. The woman's voice was thick with emotion, and I felt tears start in my own eyes. Mrs. Carver, I'm so sorry. I had no idea what David was doing. You don't need to apologize, she interrupted gently. You're the reason we finally have answers about why Jeremy got so sick. You're the reason other children won't be hurt the same way. I needed you to know that what you did mattered. After hanging up, I sat in silence while Rachel continued reviewing media requests. That phone call had crystallized something important. This wasn't just about my family's destruction or my fight with Margaret. Real children had been harmed, and my actions had given their families justice. Schedule the 60 Minutes interview, I told Rachel. And set up meetings with the families who want to talk. But I want editorial control over how Lily is portrayed. She's a victim in this, not a prop for television drama. Rachel nodded, making notes. Smart choice. 60 Minutes will give you the most credible platform and the largest audience. And Emma, you should know, early polling shows overwhelming public support for your actions. You're being seen as someone who put children's welfare above family loyalty. That evening, as I fed Lily while reviewing interview preparation materials, I received an unexpected visitor. Agent Santos arrived with Chinese takeout and an update on the case. The defendants are all in federal custody, she reported, settling into a chair across from me. Margaret's trying to negotiate a plea deal based on her cooperation, but the evidence is so overwhelming that the prosecutors aren't feeling generous. What about David? He's maintaining his innocence and claiming he was following Marcus Webb's lead. The problem is, we have emails showing David personally authorizing data modifications that endangered children. His defense strategy seems to be throwing everyone else under the bus. I wasn't surprised. David had always been skilled at avoiding responsibility when things went wrong, claiming credit when they went right. Now he was applying that same approach to federal charges. Agent Santos, what happens to Lily if David is convicted? Financially, I mean. That's complex. Some assets will be subject to forfeiture, but there are protections for innocent family members. More importantly, the Victims' Compensation Fund will likely provide significant restitution. The families affected by Medicore's fraud will receive monetary damages, but as the family member who exposed the conspiracy, you may be entitled to whistleblower compensation. The idea of receiving money for destroying my own family felt surreal, but Lily's future had to be my priority now. There's something else, Agent Santos continued. We've received intelligence that suggests this conspiracy extends beyond Medicore. Other pharmaceutical companies may have been using similar tactics to manipulate pediatric trial data. Your testimony could be crucial in exposing industry-wide corruption. I looked down at Lily, who was gazing up at me with those serious dark eyes that Margaret had claimed for the Morrison family. Now I understood that those eyes would see a very different world than the one David and Margaret had tried to construct for her. Agent Santos, how long is this going to continue? The investigation, the media attention, the trials. Federal cases move slowly. We're looking at potentially 2 years before final resolution. The media attention will probably peak and fade, but resurge during the trial. As for your role, that depends on how cooperative you want to be with ongoing investigations. After she left, I sat in the quiet safe house apartment, holding my daughter and thinking about the choice ahead of me. I could retreat into privacy, raise Lily quietly, and try to rebuild our lives away from the wreckage of the Morrison family empire. Or I could become a public advocate for the children David's company had harmed, using the platform this scandal had given me to push for industry reform. The 60 Minutes interview would be my first major decision about which path to take. In a week, I would sit across from one of America's most respected journalists and tell the story of how a new mother's fight to protect her baby had exposed a conspiracy that endangered dozens of children. But tonight, for the last time before becoming a public figure, I was just Emma, a woman holding her daughter in a federal safe house, surrounded by the debris of her destroyed marriage and the weight of truths she'd never wanted to learn. Tomorrow, I would start preparing to tell the world what the Morrison family had done to innocent children. But first, I needed to say goodbye to the woman I'd been before I learned that sometimes protecting your own child means exposing everyone else's secrets. The 60 Minutes interview was scheduled for a neutral location, a conference room in a downtown hotel that had been swept for security and equipped with professional lighting. As I sat across from veteran journalist Diana Walsh, Lily sleeping peacefully in a carrier beside my chair, I felt the weight of representing not just my own story, but the voices of 47 children whose parents would never get this platform. Mrs. Morrison, Diana began, her voice carrying the authoritative tone that had made her one of America's most trusted reporters. When you first held your daughter Lily, did you have any idea that within a week you would expose one of the largest pharmaceutical fraud cases in recent history? No, I replied, keeping my voice steady despite the cameras and lights. I was just a new mother who wanted to protect her baby. I had no idea that my mother-in-law's attempts to gain custody were connected to my husband's company endangering other people's children. Diana leaned forward slightly, her expression showing genuine interest rather than sensationalist curiosity. Walk us through that moment when you realized this wasn't just a family dispute. I thought carefully about my response, aware that millions of people would see this and that the families of harmed children would be watching. When the hospital administrator told me that the medical justifications for keeping Lily away from me were based on test results that didn't exist, I knew someone was deliberately manipulating the situation. But it wasn't until my mother-in-law confessed that she was being paid to create a custody case that I understood the true scope of what was happening. Your mother-in-law, Margaret Morrison, was a respected pediatric nurse. What was it like to discover she was willing to fabricate medical records involving your newborn daughter? The question cut deep, but I'd prepared for it. It was devastating. I'd trusted her medical expertise, her experience with children. To learn that she was using those credentials to deceive me and potentially harm Lily, it felt like a betrayal of everything healthcare professionals are supposed to represent. Diana consulted her notes before continuing. The federal investigation revealed that Medicore Industries, where your husband worked, had been falsifying safety data for pediatric drugs. 47 children were harmed by medications that should never have received FDA approval. When did you first learn about your husband's involvement? This was the hardest part, discussing David's crimes on national television while our daughter sat beside me. I learned about it when Margaret confessed that she believed David and his business partner Marcus Webb were facing federal prison time for child endangerment. She thought she was protecting Lily from parents who were criminals, but she became a criminal herself in the process. How do you reconcile loving someone with learning they've done terrible things? I looked down at Lily, who had woken up and was gazing at me with those serious dark eyes. I don't know if you can reconcile it. I think you just have to accept that people are capable of compartmentalizing their lives in ways that allow them to love their own children while harming other people's children. David was a good father to Lily, but he was also someone who endangered 47 other children for profit. Diana's next question was one I'd been dreading. Do you blame yourself for not knowing about your husband's activities? I've asked myself that question every day since his arrest, I answered honestly. I was a forensic accountant, someone trained to detect fraud and follow money trails. But I never investigated my own husband's business because I trusted him completely. Maybe I should have been more suspicious when he was stressed about FDA investigations. But when someone you love tells you they're dealing with regulatory bureaucracy, you don't automatically assume they're endangering children. The media has portrayed you as a heroic mother who exposed federal crimes to protect her baby. How do you feel about that characterization? I don't feel heroic, I said firmly. I feel like someone who stumbled into a situation that forced me to choose between protecting my family's reputation and protecting my daughter's well-being. The real heroes are the parents of the children who were harmed by Medicore's drugs, who trusted the medical system to keep their kids safe and were betrayed by people like my husband. Diana switched focus to the broader implications. What do you think this case reveals about pharmaceutical safety oversight? It reveals that when profit margins become more important than patient safety, children suffer. The FDA approval process exists to protect vulnerable populations, especially kids who can't advocate for themselves. When companies manipulate that process, they're essentially gambling with children's lives. You've been offered substantial sums for book deals and documentary rights to your story. What are your plans? I'd been dreading this question because my answer would surprise people. I'm not interested in profiting from my family's destruction or from the suffering of the children Medicore harmed. Any money I receive from telling this story will go into a foundation to support families affected by pharmaceutical fraud and to advocate for stronger pediatric drug safety protocols. Diana's eyebrows rose slightly, clearly not the answer she'd expected. That's a significant financial sacrifice. It's not a sacrifice, I corrected. It's responsibility. I didn't choose to become the face of this scandal, but now that I am, I have an obligation to use that platform for something meaningful. What would you say to other family members who suspect their loved ones might be involved in harmful activities? This was my opportunity to deliver the message I'd come here to share. Trust your instincts. Don't let family loyalty prevent you from protecting innocent people. And understand that exposing wrongdoing isn't betraying your family, it's preventing them from causing more harm. Finally, Mrs. Morrison, what do you want Lily to know about this time in her life when she's old enough to understand? I looked down at my daughter, who was reaching for my finger with tiny, perfect hands. I want her to know that sometimes the most important thing you can do is speak up for people who can't speak for themselves. That protecting one child, even your own, sometimes means protecting all children. And that the truth, no matter how painful, is always better than a lie that allows harm to continue. After the cameras stopped rolling, Diana Walsh approached me privately. Emma, I've been doing this for 30 years, and I've rarely seen someone handle this kind of situation with such grace. Your daughter is lucky to have you. The interview aired 2 weeks later to an audience of over 20 million viewers. The response was immediate and overwhelming. My temporary email account received thousands of messages, from parents thanking me for exposing pharmaceutical fraud, from healthcare workers sharing their own concerns about industry practices, from abuse survivors praising my courage to speak against family members. But it was a message from Jeremy Carver's mother, Linda, that affected me most. Emma, Jeremy watched the interview with us. He's 8 years old and still dealing with developmental delays from the Medicore drug, but he said he's proud that Lily has a mommy who protects children. Thank you for giving him hope that adults will fight for kids. The foundation I'd announced during the interview began taking shape immediately. Legal experts volunteered their services, child advocacy organizations offered partnerships, and pharmaceutical whistleblowers reached out to share their experiences. What had started as my personal fight to protect Lily was becoming a movement to protect all children from corporate greed. Margaret's plea hearing was scheduled for the following month. Her attorneys had negotiated a deal in exchange for complete cooperation with federal investigators, but the judge would ultimately decide whether to accept the arrangement. Rachel advised me to attend, both for closure and to represent Lily's interests in the proceeding. The federal courthouse was surrounded by media when I arrived, Lily bundled against the October cold. Inside, the courtroom was packed with reporters, federal prosecutors, and families of children harmed by Medicore's drugs. Margaret sat at the defendant's table looking smaller and older than I'd ever seen her, her shoulders hunched with the weight of her choices, when Judge Patricia Chin called for victim impact statements. I stood up, Lily in my arms. Your Honor, my name is Emma Morrison, and I'm here representing my daughter Lily, who was the target of the defendant's conspiracy to commit custodial interference. I looked directly at Margaret as I spoke. Margaret Morrison used her medical credentials and family relationship to manipulate access to my newborn daughter, fabricating medical records and creating false justifications for emergency custody. Her actions weren't motivated by love for her granddaughter, but by money paid to her by conspirators seeking to hide evidence of federal crimes. I paused, gathering my thoughts for what I needed to say next. But Margaret's crimes went beyond what she did to my family. By helping to obstruct the federal investigation into Medicore Industries, she delayed justice for 47 children who were harmed by fraudulent drug trials. Every day that investigation was delayed was another day that dangerous medications remained on the market, potentially harming more children. Margaret's shoulders shook slightly, but she didn't look up. However, I continued, I want the court to know that Margaret's cooperation with federal investigators has been complete and honest. Her confession provided crucial evidence that helped expose the full scope of Medicore's crimes. While I cannot forgive her attempt to steal my daughter, I acknowledge that her cooperation may prevent future harm to other children. Judge Chin nodded thoughtfully before addressing Margaret directly. Mrs. Morrison, do you have anything to say before sentencing? Margaret stood slowly, her voice barely audible. Your Honor, I thought I was protecting my granddaughter from parents who I believed were facing federal prison. I was wrong about my methods, but I was not wrong about the danger David and Marcus pose to children. I accept full responsibility for my crimes, and I hope my cooperation helps ensure that no other children are harmed by pharmaceutical fraud. She turned toward me, tears streaming down her face. Emma, I'm sorry. I was wrong to doubt you, wrong to try to take Lily, wrong to believe that fraud was justified to protect family. I hope someday you can forgive me, but I understand if you cannot. Judge Chin sentenced Margaret to 18 months in federal prison, followed by 3 years of supervised release and community service focused on patient advocacy. It was a lenient sentence considering the charges, but her cooperation had been essential to the government's case against the larger conspiracy. As we left the courthouse, Rachel walked beside me, carrying legal documents that would reshape Lily's future. The civil settlements are being finalized, she reported. Between the whistleblower compensation and the victim restitution funds, Lily's college education is secure. More importantly, the foundation now has enough funding to support its mission for years. That evening, as I fed Lily in our new apartment, we'd moved out of the safe house but remained under occasional federal protection. I reflected on how completely our lives had changed. 6 months ago, I'd been married to a pharmaceutical executive, living in suburban comfort, trusting that the people I loved were fundamentally good. Now I was a single mother, a federal witness, and the reluctant face of a movement to protect children from corporate greed. My husband was serving a 12-year federal sentence, my mother-in-law was in prison, and my daughter's father would miss most of her childhood, but I was also someone who had prevented future harm to innocent children, who had exposed a conspiracy that prioritized profits over pediatric safety, and who had built something meaningful from the wreckage of personal tragedy. As Lily fell asleep in my arms, I thought about the legacy I wanted to leave her. Not the story of how her family was destroyed by federal crimes, but the story of how her mother chose truth over comfort, justice over loyalty, and protection of all children over protection of family secrets, the reckoning wasn't over. There would be more trials, more media attention, more difficult conversations about her father's choices when she was old enough to understand. But the foundation had been laid for something better, a world where pharmaceutical companies couldn't endanger children with impunity, where medical credentials couldn't be used to manipulate families, and where one mother's determination to protect her baby had grown into a movement to protect all children. Margaret had been right about one thing: Lily deserved protection from people who harmed children for personal gain. She just hadn't realized that included everyone in her own family except the mother she'd tried to replace. 3 years later, I stood before the Senate Subcommittee on Health, Education, Labor and Pensions, holding a photograph of Lily on her third birthday. The committee room was packed with reporters, pharmaceutical industry representatives, and families whose children had been harmed by unsafe drugs. This was the culmination of everything that had begun in that hospital room when I first fought for my daughter. Senators, I began, my voice steady despite the magnitude of the moment. 3 years ago, I was just a new mother trying to protect my baby from what I thought was family manipulation. I had no idea that my fight would expose a conspiracy that endangered dozens of children and reveal systemic flaws in how we protect our most vulnerable patients. Senator Elizabeth Warren leaned forward from her position on the dais. Ms. Morrison, your foundation has documented over 200 cases of pharmaceutical companies manipulating pediatric trial data in the past 3 years. Can you explain to this committee how widespread this problem has become? I consulted my prepared notes, but the statistics were burned into my memory from countless presentations to medical boards, regulatory agencies, and parent groups. Senator Warren, our investigation has revealed that data manipulation in pediatric drug trials is not an isolated problem limited to companies like Medicor. We've identified systematic issues across the industry, including selective reporting of adverse events, manipulation of dosage calculations to hide side effects, and suppression of studies that show negative outcomes. Senator John Cornyn, known for his skepticism of regulatory oversight, interrupted. Ms. Morrison, while these allegations are serious, how do we balance the need for oversight with the pharmaceutical industry's ability to develop life-saving medications for children? It was a question I'd fielded hundreds of times, and I was ready for it. Senator Cornyn, the families in this room today aren't anti-pharmaceutical development. We want safe, effective medications for children. But we also want transparency and honesty in the testing process. When companies hide data that shows their drugs harm children, they're not advancing medical science, they're gambling with young lives for profit. I gestured toward the gallery where Jeremy Carver sat with his mother Linda. Now 11 years old, Jeremy still struggled with developmental delays from the Medicor drug he'd received as an 8-year-old. Jeremy Carver could have been helped by properly tested medications. Instead, he was harmed by a drug that should never have reached the market because the company hid safety data. The hearing continued for 4 hours, with testimony from pediatric physicians, FDA officials, pharmaceutical executives, and affected families. But the moment that would make headlines came when Senator Warren asked me directly about accountability. Ms. Morrison, your ex-husband David Morrison was sentenced to 12 years in federal prison for his role in the Medicor conspiracy. Your former mother-in-law served 18 months for her part in the cover-up. Do you believe justice has been served? I took a deep breath, knowing my answer would be dissected by legal experts and media commentators. Senator Warren, individual accountability is important, but it's not enough. David Morrison and Margaret Morrison paid for their specific crimes, but the system that enabled those crimes is still largely intact. Until we have mandatory public disclosure of all pediatric trial data, independent oversight of pharmaceutical safety testing, and criminal penalties for executives who knowingly endanger children, we haven't achieved real justice. After the hearing, I walked through the Capitol building corridors, past marble statues and oil paintings of historic figures who had shaped American democracy. The irony wasn't lost on me that a woman who 3 years ago couldn't get nurses to bring her own baby to her hospital room was now testifying before the U.S. Senate about pharmaceutical reform. Rachel met me outside the building, her arms full of legal briefs and a satisfied expression on her face. The Pediatric Drug Safety Act has 23 co-sponsors now, she reported. Your testimony today probably just gave it enough momentum to reach a floor vote. The Pediatric Drug Safety Act was legislation we'd been pushing for 2 years, requiring pharmaceutical companies to publicly disclose all pediatric trial data and establishing criminal penalties for executives who knowingly suppress safety information. It wasn't everything we wanted, but it was a significant step toward protecting children from the kind of corporate manipulation that had nearly destroyed my family. Any word from David? I asked as we walked toward my car. Rachel's expression grew somber. His lawyers submitted another appeal request. It was denied. He's got 7 more years to serve, minimum. I felt the familiar mixture of sadness and relief that always came with updates about David's imprisonment. He was Lily's father, and part of me mourned the loss of the man I'd thought I married. But he was also someone who had endangered children for profit, and his continued incarceration meant other kids were safer. That evening, I returned to my apartment in Arlington, Virginia, a modest 2-bedroom place that had become our permanent home after the federal protection ended. Lily was at her babysitter's, a warm woman named Maria whose own grandson had been harmed by a different pharmaceutical company's fraudulent trials. The apartment was quiet except for the hum of my computer, where I was reviewing testimony for tomorrow's FDA advisory panel meeting. The foundation had grown from my personal quest for justice into a national organization with 12 staff members, offices in 3 cities, and an annual budget of $2.3 million funded by whistleblower awards, legal settlements, and donations. From families we'd helped. My phone buzzed with a text from Dr. Sarah Chen, who had become both a professional ally and personal friend. Saw your Senate testimony on C-SPAN. Lily should be proud when she's old enough to understand what her mother accomplished. Lily. Everything I'd built over the past 3 years was ultimately about creating a safer world for her and children like her. At 3 years old, she was a bright, curious toddler who loved books about animals and had an uncanny ability to sense when other children were upset. Sometimes I wondered if her early exposure to institutional manipulation had made her more sensitive to others' distress, or if she'd simply inherited my investigative instincts. Margaret had been released from federal prison 8 months ago and was serving the remainder of her sentence under house arrest. She'd written me several letters requesting to meet Lily, but I hadn't responded. Forgiveness was a process, and I wasn't ready to expose my daughter to someone who had tried to steal her, regardless of the motivation. My laptop chimed with an email from a journalist working on a documentary about pharmaceutical fraud. The subject line read, 3 years later, where are they now? These retrospective pieces appeared periodically, usually focusing on how the various defendants were coping with the aftermath of their convictions. David had given one interview from federal prison, in which he claimed to be a changed man who now understood the harm he'd caused. He'd established a prison tutoring program for inmates working toward their GEDs and had allegedly become a mentor to younger inmates. His parole hearing wasn't scheduled for another 4 years, but his attorneys were already building a case for early release based on good behavior and community service. Marcus Webb had received a 15-year sentence and was reportedly struggling with prison life. His wife had divorced him 2 years ago, taking their children and most of their assets in the settlement. Unlike David, Marcus had refused all interview requests and maintained his innocence despite overwhelming evidence of his leadership role in the conspiracy. Margaret's post-prison life was quieter. She'd lost her nursing license permanently and was working as a patient advocate for elderly residents in assisted living facilities, ironic work for someone who had manipulated medical records, but perhaps genuine in its intent to help vulnerable people. As I prepared for bed, I checked the security system that had become routine since receiving occasional threats from pharmaceutical industry supporters who viewed me as an enemy of medical progress. The death threats had been worse during the first year after going public, but they decreased as public opinion increasingly supported our advocacy work. I walked through Lily's room, straightening her toys and books, preparing for her return tomorrow evening. Her walls were decorated with pictures she'd drawn of hospitals, not scary places in her imagination, but colorful buildings where doctors and nurses helped children feel better. It was a healthier relationship with medical institutions than I'd managed to maintain. On her bookshelf sat a photo from her first birthday party, celebrated in our new apartment with a small group of friends we'd made through the foundation. Linda Carver and Jeremy were there, along with other families whose children had been harmed by pharmaceutical fraud. It had been a celebration not just of Lily's growth, but of the community we'd built from shared tragedy. The next morning brought news that would reshape everything again. Rachel called as I was reviewing FDA testimony over coffee, her voice tight with excitement and apprehension. "Emma, turn on CNN. There's been a major development." I switched on the television to see a breaking news banner: Federal Grand Jury indicts senior FDA officials in pharmaceutical bribery scheme. The reporter was standing outside the Department of Justice, holding papers that looked thick enough to represent dozens of charges. Federal prosecutors announced that a 3-year investigation into pharmaceutical industry corruption has resulted in indictments against 12 FDA officials accused of accepting bribes to expedite drug approvals, including several pediatric medications. My blood ran cold. If FDA officials had been taking bribes to approve dangerous drugs, then the scope of child endangerment was far larger than we'd ever imagined. My phone rang immediately, Agent Santos, whom I hadn't spoken with in over a year. "Emma, we need to talk. This new investigation started with information we gathered from the Medicore case, but it's grown into something much bigger. We're going to need your testimony again." Another investigation. More testimony. More media attention. More years of my life dedicated to exposing pharmaceutical corruption instead of simply raising my daughter in peace. But as I thought about Jeremy Carver and the hundreds of other children whose stories had crossed my desk, I knew there wasn't really a choice. This wasn't about my convenience or my desire for a normal life. This was about ensuring that what happened to Lily in her first week of life, being used as a pawn in a conspiracy to hide corporate crimes, never happened to another child. "Agent Santos," I said, "I'll cooperate fully. But I have conditions. Any investigation that uses my testimony must include provisions for supporting families of affected children, and any settlements must fund ongoing pediatric drug safety research." Agreed. "Emma, I know this isn't what you wanted when you first called hospital administration about not being able to see your baby. But what you started that day has probably saved hundreds of children from being harmed by dangerous drugs." After hanging up, I sat in my quiet apartment, drinking coffee and watching morning news coverage of the latest pharmaceutical scandal. In a few hours, I would call Lily's babysitter and explain that our lives were about to become public again. I would schedule meetings with my foundation staff to prepare for another round of congressional hearings and media attention, but first, I wanted to remember why this mattered. I pulled out my laptop and opened the file I'd kept since the beginning: testimonials from families whose children had been helped by our advocacy work. "Maria Santos from Phoenix, because of your foundation's work, the drug that harmed my daughter was pulled from the market before it could hurt other children." Robert Chen from Boston, "The compensation fund you helped establish paid for my son's special education needs after he was damaged by fraudulent trial drugs." Linda Carver from Chicago, "Jeremy is doing better now that he's getting proper treatment. Thank you for making sure the doctors finally knew the truth about what had happened to him." Hundreds of similar messages, each representing a child whose life had been improved because a new mother had refused to accept that she couldn't see her own baby. I closed the laptop and looked out my apartment window at the Virginia morning, thinking about the choice that lay ahead. I could step back, focus on raising Lily privately, and let other people fight the next phase of this battle. Or I could continue being the public face of pediatric drug safety reform, knowing it meant years more of congressional hearings, media scrutiny, and personal sacrifice. The decision was really no choice at all. Because somewhere in America, there were children taking medications that pharmaceutical companies knew were dangerous. There were parents trusting a system that prioritized profits over pediatric safety. There were families about to experience the same devastating betrayal that had torn apart my marriage and landed my mother-in-law in federal prison. I picked up my phone and called Rachel. "Schedule a press conference for tomorrow afternoon. We're going to announce the foundation's involvement in the FDA bribery investigation." "And Rachel?" "Start preparing for another long fight." As I ended the call, I realized that the woman who had once been dismissed as an overwrought new mother had become something Margaret Morrison never expected, a force for systemic change who wouldn't stop fighting until no child was endangered. By corporate greed disguised as medical progress, the security footage from St. Mary's Hospital had indeed told a different story than the one Margaret had tried to create. But the real story wasn't about a grandmother attempting to steal a baby, It was about how a mother's determination to protect her own child had grown into a movement to protect all children, and that story was far from over. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe and turn on the notification bell, so you don't miss any upload. From us,